All right, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome to Ask Me Anything. I wanted to go ahead and make a couple of announcements and answer some questions that I've received online. I want to just remind you that your work on a survey of Matthew 16, 1 to 20 is due this coming Saturday on Matthew 16, 1 to 20 is due November 9th by the end of the day, 11:59 p.m. And note, this is only a survey. I really want to make it imperative that everyone actually reads the instructions each week, because I'm getting work that I'm not asking for, which then dilutes the rest of your work. So make sure you recognize this is only a survey. It's also really important that you watch the video that's sitting in this week's module that talks about how to improve your work, ways to improve your survey work, and pay attention to that. Let me just say a couple of things. After you've created your outline, again, the main units and subunits, write 2 or 3 sentences that justify where you divided between the main units. That's going to help to clarify in your mind how you got your divisions. That's a tip. The best students do it. I would suggest everybody do it. So include a justification of your divisions. Also make sure that you understand what a major structure is. This is still a growing edge for many folks in the class. It's normal, but make sure that when you do your survey, that if you have, say, just say 3 units. So we have unit 1, unit 2, unit 3, and let's just say hypothetically this is verses 1 to 5. This is 6 to 25, and this is, say, 26 to 30. So we just made up a section here that when you're doing your major structures that just work inside of Unit 1 or just inside of Unit 3 are not major structures. The question you want to ask is, how does the unit connect to the next unit or to the last unit? And then how does this unit connect to what comes before it? Those are major structures. Major structures either connect major units, or if they don't, that means they have to work within a unit. If a structure only works within a unit, it's only a major structure if the verses that it works in are more than 50% of the whole. So for example, in the second unit where we have like almost 20 verses out of 30, this obviously would be the 50% rule would go into effect here if you had a structure that was just in here. Otherwise, it's not. And again, if we're talking about A-level surveys, I need to be able to see that you understand the difference between a major and a minor structure. Then another piece that folks are still struggling with is the issue of strategic area. A strategic area is an area that has to go back to your structural relationships. If you don't connect your strategic area to a structural relationship, that's just what you think is important. So you need to justify that. And a strategic area always is going to just be a couple of verses rather than an entire text. So make sure that when you list your strategic area, that it's just a small section of the whole that best represents a particular structure. Now, let me say a couple things about interpretation. Again, this week's assignment is just on Matthew 16, 1 to 20. It's just a survey. And then the following week, the work due on November the 16th will be only interpretation. These are going to be the first 2 of the officially graded assignments. When we work on the interpretation, also the video suggestions for improving your interpretation that you'll want to watch. But let me just say a couple of things. Make sure that you cite the verses that you're making your observations in within your observations. Also, I need everyone to add more depth and breadth. I'm getting very short assignments that essentially almost anybody, frankly, could have turned in with or without seminary. And I need to see some real substance in the observations. And then I need you to be making inferences on the observations. Again, review some of the samples that are included in the course center. And if you don't know what to do, at least you can just follow the model that my samples are abbreviations. Those aren't even a comprehensive type of thing. So you want to be thinking, I need to spend 6 to 8 hours on this assignment, and that's going to look like more than, say, 5 or 6 observations, and that's the work. You need to really push hard so that you can get to the depth in the biblical text that, frankly, I mean, you deserve, let alone the people that you're going to be teaching the scriptures to or preaching or sharing with them. You need to get real depth. So when I add depth and breadth to your work, that means you need to add more observations and start simple. Simple observations lead to simple inferences that then can lead to more complex observations and more complex inferences. But the only way to get to that is to make multiple observations and try to make an observation that's more than just copying the text. That's not really an observation. You want to say something about the text. When you get stuck and you don't know what to observe, go back to that worksheet, and you can go back into the work that we did in the actual on-campus hybrid and look at that sheet, suggestions for improving your work. I go over it in the videos on how to do detailed observations, but look at the types of things you can observe and begin to make those observations. And make sure when you're doing observations, you want to look at context, again, at 3 levels. It needs to be immediate. So whatever the actual assignment is, so like, for example, the immediate context that we used for this parable of the sower was verses really 1, for the sower text, 1 to 9, and then, 18 to 23. And then for that, for why Jesus taught in parables, that was 10 to 17. So that's the immediate. Then we had segment. And the segment for the parables was the whole of chapter 13. And then we have book as a whole. And you want to have at least some observations for each of these 3 levels. And again, you're going to have fewer observations as you go down. You want to do the best job on immediate, a decent job on segment, and then a little bit as you can on broader book. And then you want to add other determinants. And you can look at, again, the sample on 9:35 to 11:1. Also, this time, you'll see some videos that I created on the sower, and then I had a former TA that I had walk through his entire assignment on the sower, and you can look at that. That's like a 52-minute video, but you can see my former assistant Tim, Dr. Christian, walk through IBS and see another kind of a modeling of this. So between how I model, how he models, and some of the materials online, you can find a style that works for you, but you want to be substantive. You want to add other determinants like word study. We've talked about how to do that. Historical background, looking up key things in a Bible dictionary. The synoptic parallels. How does this work in Mark and Luke? And how do those differences point to the precise things that Matthew's interested in? So you want to use some different determinants. Then the last determinant that you use are commentaries. And again, B-level work is to at least use those 2 commentaries. If you want to do a more substantive job, you want to add beyond that. But again, spend about 45 minutes going through commentaries and taking some notes on how it fills in what you have found on your own, how maybe it challenges, or maybe it just completely gives you a new insight, and record some of that, and then write a final synthesis. So that'll be for next week for interpretation. So now let me answer some questions that I received from students here before see if any of the folks who are here on live, like one person's jumped on here live, but I got some questions that I want to answer. First, when using the Synoptic Bible or other sources, can we list them as a part of the observations, or do we list them separately like we do with the commentaries? Basically, method-wise, for all of these, you're going to essentially use observations and inferences. You always want to do observations and inferences off of really all the data that you collect. And so you can really use the 2-column format for every determinant up until you get to the commentaries, where it's usually easier just to summarize. So like when you do synoptic parallels, you're still going to make observations that you're making on the synoptic parallels and then drawing inferences. You use historical background. You can make observations, inferences towards what helps you to interpret. So you can use the same format, but what you will want to do is, like, I would start, label it context, and then immediate, and then do your observations, inferences, then segment, observations, inferences, broader book, observations, inferences. So that would be your context. Then if you do the synoptic stuff, observations, inferences, historical background, observations, inferences. So yeah, you can lay your whole paper out in the same kind of a format. And that's what you see modeled in the work that, like if you look at my 935 to 11:1, that's what I do. Now, okay, second question. When looking elsewhere in Matthew, does that fall into observations or is an element in our synthesis? Looking elsewhere in Matthew is broader book context. And so that's just going to fall right into this process again. You want to think of context as circles that are connected, with the center being immediate. So this is immediate context, segment, and broader book. And so those are all required levels of context. And you're going to use the same observation inferences piece. Okay, a third question that I received. Let's say an observation in a later section raises an observation in an earlier section. Do we just add it or put it in verse reference order? Well, that's kind of your choice. If you're typing, you can simply go back and add it back in the section it goes. If you're doing this by hand, you just put it in where it comes up. So that's exactly the point of digging in deeper. The deeper you dig, you're going to see new insights, and you're going to see new angles, and so you can just go back and add it into your context. Now, if you're doing running summaries and you come up with a new insight, you may just want to start a new section to put that insight in there. So there's flexibility. This doesn't have to be some wooden method that you feel stuck in. It's just a method where you're moving from evidence to inference, and you're holding off on the commentaries until the very end. Okay, I have two other questions. One is a question on resources, and this is more kind of a long-term question. And I also have an interesting theological question that's been raised. See, as you mentioned in a previous video, we need to up our sources when we do Bible study and not use the generic ones that are online. I've tried using Asbury Scholar, and there are quite a few articles available. But specifically for Bible study, short of buying a bunch of really expensive commentaries for every book of the Bible, are there any free resources that you recommend? The answer really is no, at least if you want scholarly opinion. Unfortunately, you have to pay for the best things. Now, there are some reputable websites that do have some scholarly resources that are free. Like you can look up Text Week. This is a liturgical site. Now, I am not recommending that for this class for resources. You need to use scholarly ones, but textweek.com is a preaching site that does have some links to some resources, especially stuff from the early church that may be helpful. Now, don't feel as though you have to go out and buy really expensive commentaries for every book in the Bible. Obviously, you do that if you have unlimited resources. If you come and look at my library over the last 30 years, I think I have a commentary on pretty much every book in the Bible, but it's taken a long time to build that. I've done it with used books. The best way to do it is you should buy commentaries on the books that you actually plan to teach and preach from. And so you make a small investment over time and it adds up. You don't have to run out and have a commentary on the entire Bible because frankly, most commentary series aren't worth buying in their entirety. I always recommend buying the best commentaries on the books, regardless of what series they come from. The only exception being is if you have unlimited resources or somebody wants to buy you a really nice gift, and then you can maybe buy a set of commentaries. But what you should be focusing on, like if I was preaching on Matthew's gospel, I'd buy the France commentary, and I'd probably buy another commentary. And so you want to just focus on what you're going to be teaching from. It's also why it's not a bad idea to preach series, because it's easier to get resources that way. So again, I could say more if you want to send another question to follow up. Now, here's an interesting theological question. This is a harder question, and I'm going to address this briefly. And again, you can say more about this if you want. The question is this. It's a question about looking at the synoptic parallels and noticing the difference in presentation that shows up in these parallels. And the student wrote, I understand that each writer has a different motive, but that shouldn't change the facts. And if it does, it seems like that would render the account as having an error. I know that sometimes these differences are reconcilable through perspective, but are there any that are irreconcilable? Any that a layperson or skeptic would throw at us that might be more difficult to explain? Is there any good way of explaining these? Well, yeah, and the fact of the matter is there are some irreconcilable differences. You can go and look at Peter denying Jesus 3 times. Go look at those very carefully, and you'll find out that in many ways, those aren't reconcilable as they're presented. All 3 Gospels recognize that it happened 3 times, but go try to put those together, or go answer the question, how many angels were at the tomb in the resurrection appearances? Have a look at some of the genealogies that show up, or go look at the story of the woman with the flow of blood, the moment when she's actually healed. Try to look at that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then also go look at the question of the synagogue ruler's daughter, and was she dead or not before Jesus got there? And so those are some things where you see some real difficulties. And so what do you do with that? Or even let's look at Caesarea Philippi. Mark says, Peter says, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ. Well, in Matthew, it says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So what did Peter really say? Which one of those things, right? And so here's the question. This gets back to a hermeneutical issue. And again, this isn't I'm going to answer this in a couple of different ways. The basic problem ends up being, and I did talk about these perspectives when we were talking about hermeneutics: world of the text, world in front of text, world behind text. Right? So you all remember these perspectives, and this is basically the text. This would be the world of the author, historical background. And this is the world of the modern reader. Now, when we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, part of the issue ends up being is that what they're presenting is that their story is the world inside of their particular book. The problem that this question assumes is that somehow these 3 different stories have to actually capture, let's just use an old phrase, exactly as it really happened. So what do you do when your witnesses have tensions in them? Does that mean if, like, let's say we thought Mark was the real version, does that mean we then don't listen to Matthew or Luke because they are errors? Well, of course not, right? And so we want to recognize that this is about that we can read these historically, but we need to see that the presentation of the text is the world in the text, and we're interpreting that, and that in some level, this whole issue of did it really happen is a different question. It's an important question, but that may be a question that's coming from our modern perspective. And it's also a question about, from a modern perspective, is how historiography is being worked out. So we're assuming that an ancient writer has to work with the material exactly like, let's say, a historian at the University of Central Florida would work with sources. So perhaps this is actually more of a problem with our place in front of the text than it is in one of these other two things. Now, let me also say this. Recognizing that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John give 4 complementary but different in some key ways. They have different emphases, they use different language, and as we said, there's actually some places where the texts don't overlap. This has been recognized all the way back into the early church. I think it was, I think it's Irenaeus, don't quote me on that one for sure, but it talked about essentially we have 4 gospels that are like the 4 compass points on the earth. So we have north, south, east, and west. And so in the totality of the 4 gospels, we get the story of Jesus. Remember, theology isn't math. And even if we solved all these kind of problems that show up in these texts, that still doesn't create faith or ultimately contradict faith. So again, I'm just going to frame that question a little bit here. And if you want to send another question in, I'll try to say more about that. But this is, again, a little bit complicated. But the key thing is, we're not called to smooth over the difficulties, because if the church wanted us to work out some of the difficulties, we wouldn't have 4 gospels. We would just have some amalgamation of all 4 gospels. But the church, in its wisdom, left us these 4 complementary stories of Jesus's life with the theological differences of each of the evangelists to give us the totality of what the church needed to be faithful disciples of Jesus. Does that always line up with what we'd like if we wanted to have a nice, neat history, be certain of how it really happened? No, but that's also kind of the trying to think of the right word. That's one of the challenges of faith. It's the scandal of the gospel that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us in all of our human messiness. Okay, so anyway, I'm going to see if we have any questions live, and then I'll shut this down. Thanks everybody for listening, and I'll see you in class. And remember your deadlines, review the videos, and thank you for your work, and I'm grateful for the chance to be your professor.